Trent, welcome to the show. This has been a very long time coming. I think when I first met you in the Detroit Pistons gym, I tried to twist your arm then to come on the show, and a few years later we finally got you on. So welcome, mate.
Yeah, Andy, I appreciate the opportunity, man.
Just to begin with, can you walk us through your background? Obviously, I know you, but can you just bring our listeners up to speed, just in case they haven't come across you yet?
Yeah, sure. Grew up in northern Michigan here in the States. Three-sport athlete in high school, kept me out of trouble. Went on to play some collegiate basketball. Wanted to get to the NBA as a player. Unfortunately, I'm not the ideal body type, and so had to find another way. And so that led me to try to develop a unique and valuable skill set, which spent some time at the University of Kentucky, more of strength and conditioning based, masters in ex-phys. From there, went down to St. Augustine, so in Florida, for my physio school. Lived about a mile from the beach, grew out my hair, learned how to surf, phenomenal experience. And then from there, after the academic pursuits, was fortunate enough to get an opportunity working in the NBA G League. It was the D League at the time. And then from there, spent almost a decade in various roles as a strength and conditioning coach, physio, and then some more executive level roles in the NBA. During that time, it's worth mentioning we've had multiple tendon specific cases and experiences, which, I knew at some point whenever the NBA kicked me out or we decided to leave, that's what I would want to do is some tendon based work. And so last year, we decided to step away from the NBA. We've got two young kids at home and full circle moment. We're back here in Northern Michigan and opened up a specialized tendon practice called the Tendon Lab. Enrolled in a PhD program with Peter Magnuson at the University of Copenhagen. And so really spending my days currently clinical care, some consulting and some research, and then planning a tendon event in April.
So you've replaced essentially a very busy life with another very busy life by the sounds of it, but one of your own making this time. So yeah, and tell us about the PhD. What are you sort of focusing in on there?
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to connect with Peter. I twisted his arm to allow me to be sort of a remote student, not based in Copenhagen, even though when I visited, it's a phenomenal city and would love to live there. Our focus is on tendon pain in elite basketball, elite youth basketball cohorts. And so we've got some studies teed up at IMG Academy down in Bradenton. First, just to get an idea of the prevalence of tendon pain, Achilles and patellar in a youth athlete cohort. But essentially, we're trying to shift from a reactive treatment of tendon-based injuries to more of a proactive development of tendon resiliency across an athletic lifespan, I guess is how you could put it. It's just an area of basketball in particular that needs more light shown upon it. So excited to dive into, again, getting an update on how common it is, but then, better understanding the structure, function, mechanical properties throughout biological development in that basketball specific cohort.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and I think there's tendons as an area in general. It's such a deep area of research, isn't it? Like the papers go well into the weeds of tendon
hmm
physiology and mechanics. I think a more applied use case of that sounds very needed, and not there's as far as I'm aware, there's not that much of it. It always sort of goes into the minutiae of detail. So I think, yeah, kudos to you. I think that's a really good approach to take. Kind of marry the two worlds.
Yeah, thanks. Really excited about it. It's, I've been reading the research anyways, and so why not enroll in a PhD program? It's sort of years in the making, and initially I debated going the skill acquisition PhD route, just because being a former player, I love being on court and understanding and working on the technical and tactical side of the game. But, the love for the weight room and the tendon and basketball space just ultimately led me to decide to go with that. So.
And tell us about the Tendon conference, because that's no, events and no easy thing to do. Where did that sort of idea come from? And yeah, tell us about the conference that you're setting up.
Sure. So my advisor, Peter in Copenhagen, he mentioned they do something similar every year or every other year, and just a small group of people that get together and share some of the latest research in the tendon space. I think keeping those get-togethers intentionally small can help encourage more meaningful dialogue,
Yeah.
which, as we both have attended larger conferences, it's easy to get lost and just have so many different topics from, ACL to ankle sprains to tendons to shoulder. And while all important and good, the goal for this is to be very specific And so I, again, took the plunge in coordinating and arranging this event that we'll host in April here in Traverse City. And, we have it teed up for 40 attendees. We've got 8 speakers from all over the world flying in to discuss the Achilles tendon. How we describe it is a working meeting for practitioners and researchers who are already fluent in tendon concepts, who want to challenge, discuss, and refine them together. And so that way we're, not just reviewing these basic concepts, which again, they're important, but we want to go a bit deeper and have some vulnerable conversations of, this is what I do, but maybe the literature, there's not 5 RCTs behind it yet, but we think there needs to be. And so we're really excited for it. We've started an 8-week newsletter, almost like an onboarding to the conference, to provide more background, not only on the speakers, but some of the big rock research papers, for attendees to get ready for the event. So a colleague of mine, Jason Ure, has been really helpful in coordinating that and sending it out every week, which is free if people want to check it out. It's a lot of good content in there. So really stoked about it. We do have about 10 spots left too. So if anybody's interested, to come to Traverse City in April, we'd love to have you.
Well, scarcity drives demand, so 10 spots left. I'm sure those will fly out pretty quick. I'm really curious when you're sort of putting together a conference like that. How do you, I guess, cherry pick who the speakers are, assuming everybody's available? Do you sort of go after people that collectively lean a certain direction, or do you try and get diversity of thought to create more friction? How do you sort of like decide who's going to speak and how you get that assortment?
Yeah, I would say a bit more of the latter, but maybe in the middle, where we started with how we wanted the day to flow, or sort of working backwards from a story. So an attendee would come to the event, they sit through the event on Saturday. On Sunday, they'd think back and say, wow, that was a really cool story that I was just told and engaged in some dialogue on. And so why we did it that way is that then helped us craft the day to say, okay, this first section, we want to talk all foundational science. Then we'll get into evaluation and diagnosis. Then we'll get into management and decision making. And so within each of those 3 pillars, we then said, okay, which individuals from a practitioner or a researcher academic are well known in this area for maybe what they've produced research wise, or maybe who are some of the thought leaders. And that led us to, again, I'm biased, but my advisor Peter is, sort of an OG in tendon research and what he's done in the loading and unloading of a tendon. And Seth O'Neill will be there as well, talking about evaluation and diagnosis. And, I could go down the list of all the speakers because they're all phenomenal in their own way, but each one adds a little bit different of a flavor. But again, they're thought leaders in their particular area.
Yeah. Let's, I'll put links to everything we're talking about with your conference in the show notes, just so that our listeners can find it really easily. Let's get straight into the thick of it. I know you've kind of worked you've played, you have an understanding of skills really deeply, clearly. You're a physio, you're an S&C coach. As it relates to tendons, how do you personally define sort of tendon health, like operationally?
Yeah, great question. I think we need to come back to this question more often than we do, because again, maybe it's just what I'm seeing on social media, but everybody's talking about tendon health, and often that equates to long duration isometrics, which are great, but I think we need to peel back the layers and say, well, what the heck does tendon health even mean? And so for me, some of the work that Carl Silbernagel has done, I think Sean Hanlon was a part of those early papers on just understanding the domains of tendon health. Where I view it as more sort of this multi-dimensional construct composed of, domains that define tissue capacity, I guess is the way you could put it. Where I think that the integration of these observable dimensions, they allow us to make a judgment about 2 things. One, the tendon's current state, but then also, our best guess on the capacity to tolerate further demands. I think this is important because we would then looking at effective rehab, that would require matching the imposed demands to both, what are the biological adaptations that we're trying to elicit or seek, as well as what are the real world outcomes our patients actually care about, right? And I bring that up because these domains are inconsistently related. An example would be the, structure and function and symptoms domain, Like we hear it all the time that, pain, structure doesn't matter for pain, this and that. And I'm sure we'll get to that at some point in the podcast, but we can't assume that improving one domain automatically improves the others, right? Where strength and pain relief are dissociated in tendon rehab. Where again, I love the weight room. I think strength is important, but getting somebody stronger doesn't mean they get out of pain, right? And I think that's often misunderstood. And the same thing with structure, right? Where I do think structure is important, but it doesn't need to normalize for somebody to get out of pain. And so, anyways, kind of a tangent, but I think just getting back to how we're defining tendon health and a better understanding of the different domains that go into this multidimensional construct are important, because it allows us to then be clear on what we're trying to improve, or like what domain are we targeting. We can then match our imposed demand with that outcome, and be more targeted in our approach.
Yeah, I like that you get to first principles there of actually defining like truly what tendon health is, rather than, I think, and I've probably been there a long time ago, this kind of cart pulling the horse idea where someone says tendon health and we immediately jump to the method that we think rehabs it, with like long hold isometrics, which probably don't do it. But I think we always get to we have a habit as a profession, I think, of jumping to the intervention that looks like the thing that people commonly do, rather than in first principle thinking like, what is this tissue? How does it biomechanically, physiologically actually behave optimally? And then back chaining, how do we get there? So I like that you root your ideology in like what a tendon is and what it's supposed to do. And like you said, not just doing the intervention first, or thinking of the intervention first. You, as far as I'm aware, you've made a whopping investment in a UTC machine, an ultrasound tissue characterization device. I became very aware of them when I used to work for Jared Amflick with Total Performance, which of course is how I met you. And I know you've now gone on to get your own very nice UTC device. There's very few of us that have had the pleasure of using those. Can you, and we've had Jared on, but can you first just tell us kind of a bit more about what the machine is? And then we'll talk about some things around structure afterwards. But yeah, for you, like why did you get the UTC device? Because I think that really sort of like probably anchors maybe part of your philosophy, if you don't mind me saying.
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, just being exposed early on to UTC with the challenging case that we had, and having Jared, and then obviously getting to know you through Jared is sort of kicked off this whole venture in the tendon space. And yeah, I decided to purchase a UTC, one of the few that we have in the States. It just provides more granular level detail than any other imaging modality for tendons, right? It's a normal ultrasound probe, which you can do B mode on it, and you can get thickness and hypoechogeneity and neovascularization via power Doppler. But then with the UTC, again, as you know, Andy, you can turn the lights on, quote unquote, and discriminate some of these aligned fibril structures from the disorganized tendon structure by providing just high resolution imaging. So we can see some of these smaller changes in tendon structure that not always visible on conventional ultrasound or MRI. So essentially, I guess for your listeners who aren't aware of UTC, it's a normal ultrasound probe that sits in a motorized tracker. It was developed in equine, which is kind of cool. And essentially sits in this tracker, takes 600 transverse raw grayscale images every 0.2 millimeters in capturing the echo intensity. And then the UTC software uses these 600 slices to create a 3D data block, and analyzes the stability, the echo stability, if you will, over successive images, which then correlates to the ultrastructure integrity, and gives you a nice output of these 4 color-coded echo types. The type 1, the highly aligned, all the way to type 4, which is more of your amorphous, fluid, non-tendon material. So, in 45 seconds, you can have a fantastic extended field of view grayscale output, as well as diving a bit deeper and understanding what's going on with this tendon. Not the whole, it doesn't answer everything, but it's definitely a piece of the equation.
Yeah, beautifully put, by the way, mate. That was a fantastic summary of a UTC machine that I'm not sure I could ever get to myself. So, good job there. Okay, with that in mind, then, how do you sort of, what for you, how do you see the relationship of structure, symptoms, and function? I know that's a big question, but it probably follows on nicely from kind of, okay, that's what the UTC device does. Now you have that. How do you then manage that relationship between those three big things?
Yes, often divisive when we have, talk about imaging and structure and all that. And for me, it's, what happens when a tendon is overloaded? It becomes thicker. You have your proteoglycans and glycosaminoglycans. There's swelling, there's blood flow, and eventual matrix changes and collagen disorganization. And really, that's mechanically inferior tissue composition, where you have more of that type 3 collagen, more so than the type 1. And that shift alters the mechanical properties. And, in relation, particularly the Achilles tendon becoming more compliant in a tendinopathic state. That's, not just pain, we're talking potential performance or function being impacted. And so from my perspective, I think it gets messy when you try to correlate structure and pain. But again, structure, the structure alteration is a risk marker for injury. It's one of the larger ones, and there is some literature to support that. But it isn't necessarily required to normalize for full recovery, right? And so if you have structural change, there could potentially be an increased risk of injury or time loss. I think is it Daniel Cushman out of Utah has come out with some, multi-institutional papers on, I think they had a high negative predictive ratio. So if you had a normal tendon, you're less likely to get injured. And there's been some other papers that have come out recently on that. And even just on Twitter and X, Seth O'Neill tweeted, I think one of his PhD students, Sam Briggs, has a nice paper coming out on structure and function of non-surgical management of Achilles tendon rupture, and just being able to show these matrix changes and tendons can adapt, where tendinopathy is preceded by an abnormally high collagen turnover. And so this whole notion of tendons not being able to adapt, I think we need to rethink that. And again, I think, a couple other papers just to know, top of mind, like Patrick Corrigan, Andrew Sprague, the Finland group, they've had some papers in looking at structure being related to function and defining function, differently. So from my perspective, I just think we need to consider not just structure and pain, but then also pain and function and structure and function, and particularly in athletes where, if somebody just wants to get out of pain, right, give them a hug, doesn't matter, structure, leave them on the table, walk away. When you come back, their tendon doesn't hurt. But in athletes, when you have structural change, that is a potential performance limiting factor. And so we need to make sure that we're tracking both the pain, function, and the structure. So again, I don't have it all figured out by any means. I have a lot of questions still, which is part of the motivation for having my own UTC to help ask some of those or evaluate some of those questions. But I just think we need to come back to what is the goal. It's the adaptive response versus the clinical outcome, and what is the athlete or what is the client in front of us? Are they an athlete? Are they a person just wants to get out of pain? And then how those three, structure, function, and pain, can relate.
Yeah, and are you, with your PhD, are you looking more at the Achilles or patella, or both? Are you sort of specifying which tendon you're going after and sort of as your focus?
Yeah, so the first study we're looking at, we're actually going to do both.
Okay.
And the first one is just simply getting an update on prevalence of tendon pain in the youth athlete cohort, adolescent cohort, where if you look at the literature, previous literature supports obviously higher percentages or prevalence of patellar tendon issues. You go to a high school basketball game and you see everybody wearing the Chopat brace or the tape around their patellar tendon. But I do think there are, more Achilles issues than maybe are reported. Now you could say, okay, well, is that apophysitis? Is that Seavers? There's some, again, work out of Delaware that has said even in a apophysitis growth plate based issue, the tendon is also thickened. And so I don't know that we should differentiate between the two. I think we should consider both. And then once we get through that, looking more at a potential longitudinal based study of really trying to identify how the structure and function and mechanical properties are changing over time. There has been some done work on that. Joe Cook has done some work, early on looking at a basketball cohort. I think we need to revisit some of this, particularly given the rise in sport specialization, as well as if you look at even just how tendon pain is diagnosed in the literature, there's a lot of heterogeneity in the testing battery. And I think there even is discussions now of, well, what is tendinopathy? Like, how are we defining that? So having to rely on some of these Delphi consensus statements that were recently put out. But it's kind of ever changing in a way where, with the PhD, as I'm sure you know, Andy, it's trying to answer just one question. But at the same time, for me, I'm not in a hurry, at least not right now, to finish it. And so I want to make sure that we're doing it the right way and trying to really understand what we should be collecting and what questions we should be answering.
Yeah, I think it's a complex picture, isn't it? Like on a sort of personal note, I've had a history of patellar tendon pain before, and I've had previous phases in my life, mainly before working in the tendon space, a long time ago, where I had sort of like prolonged tendon pain, and I, quite comfortable saying it was tendinopathy, albeit without any imaging at the time. But then I've had relapses where I might have tendon pain for a day or 2 days, and then it goes away again, and they're very different things. But if we looked at sort of like old-fashioned literature, how that might get clinically diagnosed without imaging would still be a tendinopathy. But is it really if it's just for a day, or is it a flare-up of some symptoms from a former issue? I think like the diagnostics clinically and based on pain can be quite loose. Is there anything? I'm just curious. Is there anything you're seeing or using maybe at the moment to help you? I don't know, either quantify or monitor pain in a more meaningful way than maybe is common?
Oof. I would say, pain is probably outside of my circle of competence, given how complex it can be. Um, Obviously, it's part of the equation, part of the tendon domains of getting an understanding of symptoms. Um, to answer your question, I think one thing I've been exploring is we recently picked up the Myoton Pro device, which is essentially an algometer, and being able to assess very discrete parts of the tendon. And it essentially applies a mechanical impulse to the tissue and records the magnitude of tissue deformation that occurs in response to that and gives you a measure of stiffness. And while that isn't necessarily, like we're not measuring pain with that per se, what I am curious is taking that concept of being able to assess local tissue disorganization and decreases in stiffness, and then looking at the structure alongside of that. And so is it the same location on UTC where we see the most, the highest values of type 3, type 4, 3, 4 centimeters from the calcaneus? Do we see lower stiffness values via the compressive stiffness with the myoton? And, for me, I think that's important to understand. Again, compressive stiffness is different than tensile stiffness. Sure. And there's a good paper that just came out a couple months ago just comparing the two. But I do think compressive stiffness can shine some light, even just helping us ask better questions. So while not necessarily pain to your question, Andy, that's something I would say that I've been exploring a little bit.
Well, I guess even if it correlates, then okay, it's not the same, but maybe it can be a proxy potentially. If you
Yeah, sure.
so
Yeah, even if sorry, go ahead.
oh no, go on, you speak.
I was just going to say, even it might have been Jared, but he was talking just about the palpation. They did some research looking at palpation and how close in proximity to the greatest level of tissue disorganization were they the most painful. And it was within, I would say a centimeter or two. And so kind of similar concepts per se, but looking more so at these objective measures versus a subjective measure of pain.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen Jared. I'm sure you have too. I've seen Jared firsthand. Like palpate someone's medial tendon, that be a focal place of pain, and then put the probe on it and then see things like a plantaris and things like that. So I think I don't know how easy that is to prove like clinically that's going to happen at a certain amount of the time, but I think experientially at least I've seen him kind of marry those two things on occasions. So cool. The fun stuff is always interventions and loading, especially for a fellow gym rat like yourself, I'm sure. Can you walk me through maybe your common toolkit or ways that you might intervene with some different tendon pathologies, exercise on or non-exercise related?
Yeah, this is a fun one. And yeah, I'm a physio, medical license, but I definitely feel more comfortable in the weight room, which is maybe why I've been attracted to tendons, just because we know that that's where we're going to make our money. Um, Look, I think when it comes to loading interventions, we need to be clear about the goal, kind of going back to what I talk about with the tendon health of separating sort of what is the stimulus we need to provide to increase tissue stiffness versus, what do I need to provide to get somebody out of pain? While those two can be the same intervention, sometimes they're different. And I just think we need to be very clear about that. And so, um, at a basic level, like we know tendons respond to loading and unloading, and the compositional properties of tendons are strongly influenced by the mechanical transduction, the mechanical loading, and resulting downstream biomechanical signals. And that's done or achieved via strain, right? And so the strain being the primary mechanical stimulus that drives tendon adaptation, and um, the magnitude of strain, the rate of strain, duration, the frequency of strain, like all of those factors determine whether it's a healthy response of the tendon or a pathological, degeneration response. And so some of the work out of the Berlin group that I'm sure you're aware of, it's, looking at that sweet spot of 4.5 to 6.5% strain, and, cyclic loading within this range effectively promotes increases in tendon stiffness and material properties. And, I Falk Mersman, one of the researchers at with the Berlin group, and behind some of this research, along with Aaron Patsis and Sebastian Bohm, Falk will be in Traverse City, and so I'm really excited to talk to him in April at our event just about this whole, because it's a 10, 15 year project, really, that they sequentially had gone through to determine some of this. So, there is potentially a decoupled relationship with intensity of lifting and strain, where, again, as a strength coach, we're often prescribing exercises based on a percentage of 1 RM. And the research looking at strain was in healthy tendons, and, that was established at, 90% of NBC. And so a lot of people say, well, okay, I just need to lift 90% and I'll get that magic 6.5% strain. But if we look at, what happens in a pathological tendon and becoming more compliant, maybe it only takes 55% MVC to get that 6.5% strain. So there's a little bit of nuance with that I just want to highlight before we kind of get into more specifics of loading,
Yeah.
because I do think that's important, right, to consider. And then just like the differences in tendon and muscle, where, tendon adaptation does require a more targeted intervention, in my opinion, where, going back to pain, again, giving somebody a hug can get them out of pain. And so we don't need to be as targeted necessarily. And again, muscle's not quite to that extent, but, there is some guardrails with muscle, and you can miss and still get the adaptation you want, because it does respond to a variety of parameters. Whereas tendon, you need to be a bit more specific, I think. And again, coming back to understanding the context, et cetera. So, um, intervention, excuse me, people have heard, the isometrics, the high force isos, the long duration isos, isotonics, the heavy slow resistance, blood flow restriction. All of those are interventions that I use in really trying to progressively load the tendon over time and getting the athlete or the client back to what the sport demands. Right, we can't just do BFR on somebody, even though I'm a fan of BFR. We can't do BFR for 12 weeks with a low mechanically strained intervention, even though you can get some adaptation, and then have the athlete go back to sport and have, the running, jumping, cutting that has high rate of strain, or high rates and peak forces on the tendon from a mechanical loading standpoint. That's just not going to go well for that athlete. And so, again, working backwards from what the end goal is. Um, yeah, I know that was a lot, I guess, but I'm trying to just set the stage in a way of very foundational work before kind of getting into some specifics. But yeah, happy to talk through, I guess, any one of those if you'd like.
Yeah, do you? I think the thing that's always been interesting for me is I think there's a common way that people load tendons in that they sort of treat all diagnoses or sub-diagnoses of a tendon injury the same. So kind of like, it's an umbrella term, tendon injury. Now we load it with these common tools. But I'm sure you've seen, like, especially with like the UTC, you can get greater clarity on these kind of like more nuanced diagnoses that sit within that umbrella of tendinopathy. How do you sort of like skew your interventions or the way that you might load different types of tendon pathologies, if that makes sense?
Sure. Yeah. It's funny, you know what, debating, I go back and forth throughout my career on being extremely specific in the intervention. And what I mean by that is with UTC and some of the Achilles subtendon work, we're better understanding the subtendon twist. And we could see on UTC which particular subtendon maybe has the most pathology. And therefore, we should then try to elicit strain in that particular subtendon via a biomechanically specific position, whether it's toes in to target the lateral or toes out to target the medial or seated to target the soleus subtendon, right? And that's attractive to me because that requires a high level of evaluation and intervention. But there's a nihilistic side that says, well, just load it really heavy. You know, the tendon, the triceps are like, it's going to go through the required strain as long as you have sufficient load to that area. Same thing with loading the medial or the lateral part of the Achilles via the calcaneal inversion or eversion. Like I love reading about that and understanding and having an algorithmic approach, and maybe that does matter to a certain degree, but I don't know that we can, slam the table and say, yes, this is exactly how you need to do it. And so I bring that up to say I debate the nuance in my head every day, and I do try to be as specific as possible. But I do think it's important to just simply raise the floor with caring for tendons, particularly in the general population setting, and getting away from rest and stretching to loading the tendon. So again, a couple examples like I do for Achilles, your typical mid-portion Achilles tendinopathy, I do ascribe to the seated and standing calf raises. I know there's obviously debate with that, but I do think, some of Anne-Sophie's work out of Copenhagen looking at moderate slow loading, like there's almost in that paper, I think she's quoted as saying, load magnitude is less important than total volume. And so why not do seated and standing calf? Like, even though there's debate, like just get away from seated, just do standing. Like, why not just do both to accomplish maybe, that higher volume? So I do seated calf, do standing calf. I do enjoy the high force isometrics to improve stiffness. Again, the adaptive response of the high magnitude Berlin method, if you will, 3 to 5 second holds in different foot positions to promote increases in tendon stiffness in a pathological tendon, which is more compliant. And so it's, high force isometric seated and standing calf for, that chronic, mid portion tendinopathy. Yeah, like again, we can talk through BFR. I think BFR is more context specific. In the early phases when they are, if they're in season in the NBA, we used it quite a bit just because we felt like the tendon cells, quote unquote, were mechanically overloaded or mechanically saturated, and so therefore getting tendon adaptation via a different pathway, aka more of a hypoxic metabolic, was advantageous for us. So if they had, chronic Achilles issues, we would try to do some heavy, slow, and seated and standing, and high force isos pre-activity as sort of a stiffening exercise. But then making sure we're getting our BFR in for more dense parts of the season, just because they are mechanically overloaded. So yeah, that's one example. Lauren Pringles has got some really good stuff on the, decreasing compression on insertional Achilles tendinopathy. And, that's something that I do ascribe to if there is insertional related changes on imaging or, pain location when they're reporting symptoms. I think similarly, if there is, medial sided Achilles tendinopathy symptoms, but it's more plantaris related, and seeing some of those posterior medial changes on UTC, I guess pending the certain morphological type of plantaris. Obviously, as you know, there can be differences in plantaris morphology, but if we see that, it's okay, well, maybe we don't want to do our calf raises off of a step to minimize more of that compression of the Achilles and the plantaris. And so very similar to maybe an insertional type issue. Some of the I think Gabriel Fernandez work on decreasing motor drive or inhibition to the lateral gastroc in a chronic tendinopathic state is interesting. And so I guess to combat that, we will train toes in, toes out, based on that study, as well as based on some of the Nunez papers in the hypertrophy world. And so again, it's not a shotgun approach per se. We do want to be specific, but at the same time, if there is some uncertainty, why not train in some of these positions if we're going to get to the same place anyways?
Yeah, I think you have to sometimes zoom out. There's a certain amount of zooming in you have to do, isn't there? Where, okay, I want to elicit adaptation in the tendon. How can I best achieve that? And then I think there's a sort of zooming out approach as well of like, yes, I have to do that, but also there's a sort of neuromuscular component to this as well. Not for the tendon, but just in terms of like the system, if we just call it that loosely, of why not train in different foot positions? Because not just from a tendon perspective, but at the end of the day, an athlete is going to be in those foot positions. So let's not do all of our really neat calf work, seated, standing, whatever it is, in these very sagittal 12 o'clock foot positions if we can expose them, at least neuromuscularly and coordination wise, to these different positions. Sorry.
It was exactly spot on. Even as a warm up, like obviously want to do some higher magnitude on a leg press, which is harder to do if you don't have access to a machine. But even for myself, managing my own mid portion Achilles, like I'm doing my isometrics for my calf on a wall, and I'm doing them in the sagittal plane, and then in the frontal plane, and then in the transverse, and my foot in crazy positions. And maybe I'm not getting that high strain magnitude with 90% of my MVC, but to your point, I think training neuromuscularly in some of these quote unquote dirty positions is important, particularly in change of direction, return to play scenarios.
We've kind of gone through kind of like almost like as a story narrative. We've gone through kind of tendon health, some assessment based conversation, some loading. One of the things that I think is really interesting with tendons culturally for us is we're really good at getting tendons out of pain, and we're good at what I'm just going to call like mid-stage rehab, loosely, where we work on heavy slow loading, high force isometrics. We get that strain and force magnitude into the tendon. And then I think where I see there being a bit of a gap in rehab, and we don't always get to keep athletes long enough at this stage, is that last bit where we're trying to take let's just call it an upgraded tendon that's pain-free, structurally now quite sound, and we need to apply it in a more plyometric and dynamic, high speed, change of direction kind of capacity way. Is there ways that you've found effective, albeit not easy to lean on literature here, is there ways that you've been able to effectively kind of transition people from, let's call it traditional heavy slow, high force isometric based work into that more explosive work? Because I think there's an art to that. That's the part of rehab that I think we don't get enough exposure to with these tendon cases, because the athletes disappear, but also there's not really much literature on how do you effectively do that bridge.
I try to be a little less wrong in this area, but from my perspective, first again starting with just when we're loading a tendon fast, it's different than when we're loading it slow, as you alluded to, just simply because of the homogeneous fascicle strain distribution when you're loading it a bit slower, and the IFM having time to coordinate and load share between the fascicles, and all the tenocytes receiving a certain amount of strain. But when you're loading it fast, it's different, and so practically, whenever I have the opportunity to introduce extensive base plyometrics or some sort of stretch shorten cycle activity or elastic activity in the early phases of rehab, even if that's some pulsing with my calf work or something where I'm increasing the rate of strain on the Achilles without taking away from the goal of the heavy slow program, we try to do that. Now, again, that's challenging because, even just looking at everybody uses, I think it's Peter's graph of the 36 hours that's required for the tendon to get back to a homeostatic state, or that collagen synthesis to get back to a good state. Considering that, but I also think there's a lot of questions that we still need answers when it comes to how soon we can start to do some of these faster rate of loadings, or what is the restitution period in between loading bouts, right? For heavy slow, it's 3 times a week, separated between 48 hours. Like, I feel pretty good about that. But for the more elastic-based activity, there's some nuance. And so, again, in basketball, in the NBA in particular, it's challenging because of the competing demands and contextually specific scenarios, contract status, time in the season, that sort of thing, as you know. But big rocks for me is trying to introduce it as soon as possible, just to start to build some level of tolerance, because we know tendon morphology, structure, mechanical properties, they're very slow to adapt. Your strength, your neuromuscular, output, that all might be restored. You might be pain-free, but yet that structure, that mechanical property of the tendon is lagging. And gosh, that one might have been Kubo 20 years ago that looked at some of that. And so we often get this false sense of assurance or reassurance that the tendon's in a good spot because they don't have pain. Their peak force on an isometric is restored. But that tendon is not quite where it needs to be. And so whenever possible, being very slow or having a longer runway would obviously increase your likelihood of success. But I think we can try to meet in the middle by starting some of these elastic exercises, sooner than later. Instead of just complete your HSR, then you shift to this elastic activity. Well, by then, like that tendon has lost some of that ability to handle that high rate of mechanical loading. And so that would be one area. And then the other one is just like ensuring that we're hitting these high speeds, right? Like similar to the hamstring literature and needing to run at 90% plus. Like I'm not an expert in hamstring injuries, but needing to sprint maximally and hit some of these fast speeds to really get some of that stimuli to the muscle. I do think
kind of like protective high speed running is what you're kind of
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. And just understanding the differences in the tendon demand when you're moving at such a high pace or speed. You can't just go, shoot some spot shots, do some ball handling, change of direction drills against a coach, and then go play an NBA basketball game. Like that tendon is just, it's not prepared to handle that. So yeah, to summarize, longer the runway, the better because of the slow adaptation of the tendon properties. Trying to start elastic activity as soon as possible to start building that foundation, and then making sure that you're touching some of these, high max effort, multi-directional movements, depending on the tendon that in question, to ensure that you've given or provided that stimulus. So it's not something new that the tendon receives upon the first game back. So again, I don't know if that answers your question, Andy, but that's sort of how I would view it.
Really does, and really well summarized, I think, as well. I think there's a lot of practical take homes people can listen to there and immediately probably apply if this is the stage they're at. So Trent, it's been fantastic to be able to pick your brains. It's been a long time since we've been in a gym talking shop together, so it's been a real pleasure of mine to be able to chat to you on here today. Where's the best place for people to follow you, find you, or maybe reach out to you?
Sure. TrentSalo.com is my website. Nothing fancy on there, just a place for people to find me. I'm active on Instagram and LinkedIn, just at Trent Salo. One of the reasons I'm doing podcasts is to try to get feedback from people, smarter than I on areas that I maybe need to brush up on a little more. So if anybody has any feedback or wants to talk further on a topic tendon related, I'd love to connect. So Andy, I really appreciate the opportunity.
No, thank you, mate. Thank you.